Welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement. I'm here at the News Forum, which is, of course, the place where all voices matter. A new report from the Macdonald-Laurier Institute urges Canada and other Western countries to counter the growing dominance of China and Russia in Africa. The author of MLI's Dominance or Reciprocity report on this topic is Marcus Kolga, and he joins us here today. Welcome to the program, Marcus.
Thanks so much for having me on, Tony.
I guess the first question would be, could you describe for our audience the activities of the Chinese and the Russian governments in Africa?
Well, the Chinese and the Russians act quite differently when it comes to Africa. China has taken a long-term geostrategic approach to Africa over the past number of decades. So for some historical context, the Soviets, that's what the Russians were called back during the Cold War, were competing with the Western world for dominance and for influence in Africa. Africa was very much in the spotlight for both the Western world and for the Soviets. In the post-Cold World War, where that conflict ended, attention in the Western world and even in Russia as well sort of drifted away from Africa. And it was during that period that China, who was very much a player, but sort of on the sidelines during the Cold War, took advantage of that retreat, of the Western retreat from Africa and the Russian retreat from Africa. And during that time, it's built up its relations with various different countries, and it's really been over the past 20 years, where through various investments, it has gained considerable influence in dozens, and at this point, 40 countries that have joined the China's Belt and Road Initiative, and it's through financing various different infrastructure projects, helping build them, bringing in Chinese workers to build them, and then using Chinese nationals to operate in large infrastructure projects. This is, we're talking about ports, major factories, various different municipal infrastructure projects. It's through this process that China has really taken a hold and has an incredible amount of influence in Africa. Essentially, it has bought up large swaths of Africa, and it's doing that to control resources, energy, oil, various different minerals, especially graphite, which is very important in the processing and manufacturing of batteries. And this also means larger geopolitical influence as well. If we're talking about the UN, through this process, China has been able to control a number of votes in support of issues when they come up in the UN and in other fora as well. So that's China's primary activity there is like I said, it's been long term, it's been strategic. Whereas Russia's influence, as I was saying, after the Cold War, Russia took a retreat from Africa throughout the 90s, and it was only in the early 2000s when it started looking at Africa again. And this was primarily to find new clients for its weapons industry, to sell guns, airplanes, helicopters, and such to various authoritarian regimes throughout Africa. But it's only really been over the past 4 to 5 years where Russia has taken a very significant interest. This is mainly in African failed states that are resource rich. What it does is it sends its mercenaries. There's a group called Wagner, the Wagner Group. Wagner was active in 2014 in the Russian invasion of eastern Ukraine and Crimea. It's also been very active in Syria during the civil war there. The Kremlin created this organization basically to create sort of an arm's length group that it could have some plausible deniability in controlling. And this group has been moving around various different African states, helping stand up some of these authoritarians that run those nations in exchange for various different resources. And so that's how it's exerting its influence through basically what amounts to a mafia-like racketeering system and strategy. And so that's the two ways that Russia and China are playing in Africa right now. And unfortunately for the Western world, We haven't been paying attention.
Right.
Canada certainly has not, and we're sort of absent from the African stage, and we've allowed Russia and China to really exploit the situation on the continent.
That's a really good synopsis, Marcus. We're going to take a brief break. Welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here with Marcus Kolga. He is the author of Dominance or Reciprocity of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Marcus, great synopsis of what's going on in Africa right now with the rise of influence of both China and Russia. Clearly, it's about resources and control of those resources, as well as the kind of the geopolitical game that's going on. In terms of how that impacts on the independence of these African nations, I want you to talk a little bit about that. And I also want to talk about how this trend reinforces authoritarianism on the African continent.
Well, listen, that's a great question, Tony. And you know, I'm primarily a Russia expert that's looking at Russia's influence in Africa, not so much an African expert or Africa expert looking at Russian influence.
Right.
And so I've really sort of zoned in on how Russia is exactly doing that, how it's reinforcing authoritarian regimes and dictators on the continent, and certainly China as well. You know, I think we first have to understand that unlike the Western world, that you know, we may not always get it right when it comes to our aid and our development programs in the developing world. Russia and China have zero interest in promoting democracy. They don't have any interest in promoting transparency, nor the rule of law. They actually, those situations in those countries that do have totalitarian regimes that abuse human rights and engage in corruption, those are the sorts of the environments that Russia and China really thrive in. You know, perfect example of this is the Central African Republic, where you know, it could be defined as a failing state. It is certainly on the bottom rungs of global economies. Russia is extremely active in this country. The government there was exposed to a rising rebellion movement a couple of years ago. And the first person they called up was, of course, Vladimir Putin, because Vladimir Putin, they know, doesn't have any objections to providing weapons and manpower to help keep those sorts of governments in power. And over the past 2 years, that government has become completely reliant on the Russian government's Wagner mercenaries, which I mentioned earlier. Without those mercenaries in place in the Central African Republic, the government wouldn't be able to maintain power. And so how these mercenaries and how the Russian government, because these two are very much linked together, how they're compensated to keep these totalitarians and authoritarians in power is through resources. They're granted access to various different diamond mines, other resources, and that's how they enrich themselves through this process. So they're engaging in this sort of protective racket with these authoritarians, and then robbing the country blind. I should also mention that in the Central African Republic, the UN and various other NGOs have reported that Wagner has engaged in widespread human rights abuses, even atrocities. And so, like I said, Vladimir Putin has no interest in promoting democracy or transparency, because if those were the conditions in those countries, Vladimir Putin would have no room to operate in. China, similarly, also relies on authoritarians to maintain power and to enrich themselves. You know, corruption is the key in a lot of these nations, and it's really through corruption and the systemic corruption that China and Russia thrive in Africa.
And that's, I'm going to mention the term, the debt trap. And I think from what you're describing, that's a lot of what's going on too, that these countries become beholden to their ostensible saviors, but it comes at a cost, right?
Well, absolutely. I mean, you have a lot of these African nations that simply cannot afford, for various reasons. Some of them are just that corrupt that the state does not have the sort of funds to build up modern infrastructures. Others, just because of their situation, are unable to do so. China then swoops in and offers very attractive financing packages attractive insofar as these governments don't necessarily have to pay for the construction of that infrastructure. The terms are quite steep for those countries, and as I mentioned earlier, what happens is that China comes in, gives money, provides the funding for these infrastructure projects. The other problem is that China brings in its own workers, so the local populations don't benefit from these infrastructure projects either, and eventually they're unable to pay back the Chinese government, and that's where the Chinese government takes advantage of these nations.
Let's take another brief break. We'll be back with our guest, Marcus Kolga, after that break. Please stay with us. And we're back here at Boom and Bust. We're here with author Marcus Kolga of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, talking about the influence of China and Russia in the continent of Africa. Now we get to the part where we talk a little bit about Canada and Canada's allies, of course. What's been going on? How has Canada historically been involved in Africa, and how should Canada and its allies respond to this new challenge?
Well, Tony, sadly, Canada hasn't been anywhere near Africa for the past number of years. As much as we like to think of ourselves as a supporter of international aid and development, we haven't been doing much in Africa, and certainly not if you compare it back to the 1980s. Certainly the days of Prime Minister Mulroney. We should recall as a nation, and proudly recall, that Brian Mulroney really led the fight for sanctions and for human rights in South Africa when that country was gripped by apartheid. He received a lot of pushback from other leaders like Prime Minister Thatcher on this. But in 1986, the Western world, Canada included, imposed sanctions, and we saw a change in South Africa. And I think Canada's role was duly acknowledged by people like Nelson Mandela. Since that time, I think that we've slowly stepped back from our presence and our activities in Africa. In the mid 2000s, the Martin government, Prime Minister Martin, the short term that he was there, was able to mobilize a real strong global effort to forgive African debt, and that was a significant program that we engaged in. And during the Harper years, I think a lot of watchers or viewers might be surprised that it was in 2013 actually that Canadian aid to Africa peaked actually, and so during that period, Prime Minister Harper was actually quite active. He visited Africa a number of times. But during the Trudeau years, aside from about a month-long period where Canada was actively campaigning for a Security Council seat, and where Justin Trudeau, did a diplomatic blitz through Africa, we really haven't been present. Our aid to Africa has dipped. Diplomatically, I've been told by European officials who I interviewed for this report that Canada is largely seen as being diplomatically absent from Africa, and there are a lot of opportunities there. To be quite frank, China and Russia clearly identified those opportunities. Many of them are in the resource industry, or in the resource sector rather. But Africa is a growing nation. It's going to be one of the most populous nations in the next 20 to 30 years, continents rather, right. In the next 20 to 30 years. And there's real opportunity there beyond the resource sector for Canada to engage in mutually beneficial trade. And this is something that we need to start looking at, and we need to start doing the same with our allies.
Is there any plan in place from the allies' point of view, from the U.S. and Europe and Canada?
It doesn't seem so. I think that the Western world is dealing with so many other problems in so many other places that its attention is clearly not on Africa at the moment, which again works to the advantage of the Chinese and Russian governments. But something like a G7 Africa summit might be beneficial. To bring African nations together with Western nations and to start that dialogue, because at the moment there's just really nothing going on. Certainly not in the Canadian context, but I think in the broader Western context things seem rather quiet.
Has it at all been talked about at, I'm thinking of the G20 and the G7, has this topic come up yet?
It doesn't seem that it's come up in any meaningful way over the past few years. Unfortunately, it's not something that Western nations are looking closely at. And so while our gaze is elsewhere, Vladimir Putin is certainly grabbing our attention when it comes to Ukraine and Belarus. China is doing the same when it comes to Taiwan. While we're looking at these other areas of the world, China continues to build its influence in Africa. Russia is very much doing the same. And until we start paying a little bit more attention, there's no one is challenging Chinese and Russian dominance on the continent. We need to start doing something about that.
Let's continue our conversation. We're going to take another brief break and continue our conversation with Marcus Kolga. He is the author of Dominance or Reciprocity, a Macdonald-Laurier Institute publication. And thank you for joining us. We are going to come back for one more segment. Please stay with us. We'll be back. Welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here with Marcus Kolga. He's the author of Dominance or Reciprocity, looking at Russian and Chinese influence in Africa. Thinking of G7 countries, Marcus, France has a historic interest, I guess their history of colonialism in Africa, almost as strong as the British history there. Have they been doing anything on this front, or they've been bystanders as well?
Well, I think they've been largely looking on as some situations across Africa sort of deteriorate. Mali is a really great example of that, whereby France has traditionally sort of led the peacekeeping in that nation. It's a former French colony, of course. But over the past 6 months, those same Russian mercenaries from Wagner have appeared in Mali. And this has caused serious problems amongst other Western peacekeepers that are stationed in Mali. A number of them have stated that they will refuse to further participate in that peacekeeping mission if Russian mercenaries are in the country and fighting for the Mali government. So, I think France largely has taken a bit of a backseat as well when it comes to challenging Chinese and Russian influence on the continent.
Now, I'm thinking about the Belt and Road Initiative a little bit more, the Chinese infrastructure initiative, and there has been, I guess, reports of shoddy workmanship, of buildings and roads that crumble very soon after being completed, just as one example, and plus the overbearingness of these new colonialists, if you want to put it that way, the Chinese and the Russian governments. So is there starting to be an inkling of a reaction to that on the African continent that, maybe this is a poison chalice, or this is a situation that we don't want to see continue?
I suspect it's going to take a little bit longer for the views on China and Russia to shift, to be quite honest. I spoke to, as I mentioned earlier, a former European diplomat who was serving in one of these African countries, and we specifically talked about Chinese infrastructure projects in that country, and they said that the Chinese government will come in, as I mentioned earlier, offer wonderful terms for financing these, or steep terms, but wonderful insofar as that these local governments don't have to put up too much money to have these infrastructure projects built. Chinese workers come in and build them. But certainly with regards to roads, these roads don't last very long. As you mentioned, 2 or 3 years after they're built, they start falling apart. And these local governments themselves are then responsible ultimately for maintaining those roads and repairing them. And so this is happening not just with roads, highways and such, but various different other forms of infrastructure as well. And I think that in the coming years, I think these governments are going to look at these and start questioning the value of being part of the Belt and Road Initiative. if the workmanship is indeed that as shoddy as it is. And as we talked about earlier, a lot of these projects, a lot of them are focused on ports, of course.
Right.
The Chinese government needs ports in order to get the resources that they're extracting and that they're controlling back to China. And so a lot of these ports are built, again, with Chinese money, with Chinese workers, and are then ultimately controlled and operated by Chinese companies. That means that these governments themselves, the local governments, are getting edged out of controlling the goods that are moving through their own ports and through their own countries. So I think a lot of these African governments will start eventually wondering whether it was worthwhile to jump into the bed with China on a lot of these projects.
Well, I guess the final word is time will tell. I really appreciate that your report is bringing this issue to the forefront, so thank you for that, and we'll be watching this issue very closely. Marcus Kolga, thank you for being on the program.
Thanks for having me on, Tony.
Really interesting conversation with Marcus Kolga there. Obviously a topic that maybe not top of mind or top of the headlines, but very interesting because it talks about not only the future of these African nations and their people, but the future control of resources, the future of democracy versus authoritarianism. All of these things are being played out right before our eyes. So I'm glad somebody like the quality of Marcus is taking a good look at this. Thanks for watching today.